So I'm John Callister. For those of you who don't know me, there's hopefully no one on the call who doesn't now, but I'm lead for the music service in Staffordshire. We've got apologies from Ruth Steele. She can't be with us from City Music Service, but Jenny, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jenny Maudsley and I'm Ruth's deputy over in Stoke-on-Trent.
Thanks, Jenny. Tracy, could you do the same?
Yeah, I'm Tracy Hall. I'm the lead for Telford and Riki Music.
That's great, Tracy. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Jones. I'm the head of Dudley Performing Arts.
That's Chris. Graham?
I'm Graham Rutland. I'm curriculum consultant to the Music Partnership.
Many thanks, Graham. And Rachel?
Hi, sorry, I'm currently sat in traffic, but I will be home shortly, I hope. I'm Rachel Hayes. I'm head of music at St Margaret Ward and a consultant for the Music Partnership as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Everyone loves that kind of 4:30 in Stoke traffic. It's just wonderful, isn't it? So, yeah, so yeah, I know. Yeah, just trying to go anywhere takes an age. Right, we're really pleased we've got Graham with us today to lead the second half of these sessions. Those of you who've worked with Graham before know he's got a wealth of experience which he brings to the region. But before we do that, you may be bored of me saying this if you've been on other calls, but I do just want to pass on for anyone who's not been with us before, just a sincere thanks for everything that that you've done through this year and continue to do even over these last few weeks where you're all juggling bubbles and children at home and still trying to work with us on how do children have music lessons and keep learning and not just have this big gap until September. So a really sincere thanks from all of us for that one, and hopefully things will be easier when we come back in September. But genuinely interested after we've had Graham's presentation to hear how you're feeling about September and the year ahead, and what restrictions you feel may be there, or how you may be asked to work in school. We're obviously going to be looking at the best practice examples as they emerge from Music Mark and various other organisations and putting risk assessments together accordingly. But be interesting to know what schools are thinking about music in September as well. But I won't keep talking because we've got Graham here, and could I hand over to you, Graham, to run this presentation now?
Okay, thanks, John. I'll just share the screen so that you can see the PowerPoint. Hopefully that's appearing now. Do shout if it's not. Unfortunately, I can't see when you put your hands up, so unless somebody interrupts me verbally, we'll perhaps be better taking comments at the end. Well, 30 years ago, I was seconded to the local authority in Staffordshire to look at assessment when the national curriculum was invented. It's half a lifetime in my case, but we've had so many reiterations, haven't we, of ways of describing assessment. We've had formative assessment, summative assessment, ipsative assessment, diagnostic assessment, same things all dressed up often with different language. And similarly, in our national curriculum, first of all, we were complaining that we didn't have any levels. This is a long time ago now. And then we had end of key stage statements, whatever they were. Then we had levels, and now we haven't got levels. But instead, we've put in place flight paths, can do, can't do statements, and so it goes on. Targets based on data from testing in English and maths, data points, progress reports, and so on. And I remember having a PGCE student once who the school wanted to fail him because he wasn't referring to sub-levels in every lesson he taught. And so things tend to go a bit pear-shaped from time to time. But the basic principles behind assessment surely have stayed the same, even though they've got a bit warped due to other factors, such as Ofsted's interest in data at one point, which of course they've now withdrawn from completely in terms of internal school data. But some schools are still continuing to collect it and hold it and store it and so on. And it was quite interesting, actually, that on an inspection I was on this week, a long way away from here, of course, the school was working really hard to develop the curriculum. But at the end of the day, one of the areas for development was to continue working on assessment. Not that they weren't doing a lot of work on it, but there was still a work unfinished. And those of you who are almost as long in the tooth as me, perhaps, will remember a gentleman called Tony Knight, who actually wrote the first national curriculum document for music. And if ever you wanted a conference speaker, you'd always ask Tony Knight first of all. He was working at the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority then. And one of the things I remember him saying, he said, if anyone's found a really good system for assessment in music, I'd be grateful if they'd tell me, because I haven't found one yet. So I don't think that's a reflection on the quality of teachers of music. I think it's a reflection on the difficulty of the task. Well, of course, now Ofsted is not looking at internal data. And again, on the inspection I was on this week, a senior HMI who came to monitor us, yes, we get inspected as well, was concerned about end of unit testing and saying, you know, these things should be picked up on the way. This particular department had got revision lessons timetabled in to prepare for assessment lessons. And he was saying, well, just check it isn't a waste of 2 lessons, because surely the principles of assessment are about being embedded in teaching and teachers assessing as they go on and being aware of what the pupils need to change or do, or what the teacher needs to change in order to help the children to progress. So one of the Ofsted things that we look out for is schools that have put the cart before the horse. The system drives the practice rather than the system coming out of the practice, and the practice being the most important thing. And of course, assessment needs to be purposeful and useful and meaningful. So whatever assessment data you keep in whatever format, it needs to tell you something more than just that this pupil is better than that pupil. And some of you may know a Staffordshire head teacher named Sarah Birchall. She's at Norton Keynes. And I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying that when she was an NQT back in '91, when I started, one of the things we did was looked at her mark book. And I just pointed to a mark which said 7. And I said, Sarah, what does that mean? And she thought about it and actually didn't know. It was the result of a test she'd given the children, testing a range of musical knowledge. And that set her thinking, I know, and she's often referred to me to that with me when she's talked to me about how it really focuses on what we are keeping information for and how the assessments that we make actually are useful to us beyond just creating some sort of hierarchy. When I was at school years and years ago, my English teacher either gave me 6, 7 or 8 for my work. Never got a comment, just 6, 7 or 8. And then we went to a different English teacher who was a bit of a radical chap, and he didn't mark work at all, really. He just talked to us about it. And one day I looked over his shoulder, and in his mark book, he'd written 2 against my name. And my friend Peter had got 17 against his name. Why was I only 2 and why was my friend 17? I lost night's sleep over this. In fact, I persuaded my parents to complain to the school that he was a bad teacher because I didn't like the idea of him giving me 2. And it wasn't till the end of the term when we gave our reading books in that I realised that my reading book was number 2 and my friend's was number 17. And then we had another English teacher who actually wrote comments. You couldn't read them, but he wrote the comments on our books. And that seemed to be a bit more helpful. So numbers really are of little value unless they really mean something. So enough of the preamble anyway. Children obviously want to know how they're doing and they like to have feedback, and it is motivational to them. But it needs to be feedback which helps them to learn and helps the teacher to plan the learning. So it is then that the purpose of assessment, we've got these 2 definitions which have really been fairly unchanged over the years. The formative aspect of assessment, the checking on progress to see how far they're getting, how they're mastering what they're learning, and then teachers using the information to modify their plans. And notice that the summative assessment here is described as assessment that's used at the end of a period of learning, such as a term or a year, not a half term or a week, to measure what's been achieved. And, you know, there's stories about weighing the pig, and, you know, it doesn't actually get any heavier if you don't do anything with it or if you don't help it to grow. And you don't pull a plant up by its roots every 3 weeks to see whether it's growing or not. You leave things and you look at other aspects of the growth that come along. In Ofsted's most recent handbook, what we're using at the moment, there's 3 paragraphs there on assessment. And we look for whether assessment helps pupils to embed their knowledge and use it fluently, assist teachers in providing the next steps, and teachers should avoid misuse of assessment. So there's a little warning there. It shouldn't substantially increase workload because it should be supporting teaching and identifying, particularly at the moment, identifying gaps in learning. And that's something that perhaps is like to be a focus in your case. And data collection needs to be proportionate. And that statement there of no more than 2 or 3 data collection points per year is something that inspectors will certainly be looking for or checking up on in terms of the way the school deals with data. But again, whatever data is collected, it must be used to inform clear actions. In other words, it's got to be useful to the teacher in planning the next steps of learning for the children. It isn't just to put on a spreadsheet which the assessment coordinator keeps, and it's hopefully going to be used to prove that the school is doing well. And in fact, I've been on inspections where schools have complained formally to Ofsted that inspectors did not want to see their internal data spreadsheets. School can come along and say, OK, well, here's our PSE program. Would you like to have a look at it? And we'll say yes. And we may or may not look at it depending on what the focus is. And other things and bits of paper they'll bring along and show us. Attendance data we're quite happy to look at. But as soon as somebody comes to the team room door with a spreadsheet, the answer is always going to be, I'm sorry, it can't come into this room. We don't look at schools' internal data anymore. And that's the culture that schools are not used to. So we've had various working groups on assessment over the years. We had the task group on assessment and testing in the 90s. We've now got the assessment reform group's work, and the purposes of formative assessment are there in those 4 bullet points. And Ofsted, by the way, I think I mentioned it last time, are producing research reports on subjects. So amongst your overwhelming range of documentation and paperwork that you're getting in schools, you can look forward to a report on music learning and music education from Ofsted. Geography's got theirs, science have got theirs, modern languages, RE and maths have got theirs. Music, I don't think, has appeared yet. It'll be a fairly weighty document, which of course will be guidance if you have time to read it. But hopefully in the autumn term, we'll have a look at it and look at it with you and give some pointers from it. Interested to see what it says about assessment. Hope it doesn't contradict what I'm saying. Anyway, there we go. However, John kindly emailed me a link a couple of days ago to a document that was published last Friday called Teaching a Broad and Balanced Curriculum for Education Recovery. And the link's on the PowerPoint, which of course you will get after the session, as will all those who booked and weren't able to come today. I think about 17 people booked, but quite a number aren't able to come. So we will send that out, the PowerPoint out to everybody. And that link to that document is some generic principles about education recovery, and then there's a couple of pages on every subject. So these first bullet points are really taken from the kind of generic stuff at the beginning of the document, and there's nothing new, I don't think, there. But the one thing about assessment message is we don't assess things which are compound without being able to break that down into the component parts of the children's development. So in other words, in this case, because we're talking cross-subject, obviously, they're talking about the total mark you achieve on a paper, for example, in itself won't tell you what the pupil's weaknesses are within that paper. And similarly, a mark for a composition, perhaps a group composition at Key Stage 3, won't tell you what the contribution of each individual member was and what the issues were that caused them to succeed or not in the final product. Here it talks about tests or quizzes because, you know, Ofsted's quite obsessed with this idea that progress is about developing knowledge. And in music, of course, that knowledge needs to contribute to practical ability and skill as well, and being musical and musical understanding. But in some subjects which are more knowledge-based, then low-stakes tests and quizzes perhaps may be appropriate as you go along, or perhaps as part of a starter activity to check that what was learnt last lesson has still been remembered so that you can then move on to the next stage. And if it isn't remembered, you need to do a bit of remedial work on that. And even in a simple matter of questioning, in a very effective lesson with a low ability group I saw this week in another subject, the teacher was targeting the questions, knowing the ability of the children, and if they answered well, she was probing further. If they couldn't answer, she was either giving them thinking time and coming back, or she was breaking the question down into smaller component parts. We know that's good, part of good teaching, and that is part of assessment, isn't it? It's getting a feel of what children know and being able to support them in developing their knowledge and embedding the knowledge and understanding that they've got. In this same document then, just going slightly aside from assessment, there are some key considerations there for music. And as in other subjects too, the focus is on catching up when you're able to, when you're back in your room and can do practical work, catching up on the technical knowledge. It's more likely that in most subjects, children will have learned a lot of knowledge, but not put it into practice, not had practical opportunities. And so I think it's fairly clear that we're going to need to do a lot of work on that when we can get back to normal. I'm interested in the focus on oral development, which seems to have crept in a little bit more strongly in the music curriculum more recently in terms of people's thinking about what needs to be done. And then, of course, providing effective feedback on musical responses or choices and correcting inaccuracies. So I think that it's worth looking at that document and the music page of it. It isn't very long, actually, what it says about music. But going back then to assessment, there's another document which I have recommended to people that I've been to see over the past couple of years. And it's a document produced by the Incorporated Society of Musicians, written by Alison Daubney and Martin Fortley, researchers at Birmingham and Brighton universities, respectively, or the other way around, isn't it? But it's a very helpful document which talks about teaching the national curriculum for music and also about assessment. And their comments about assessment there, the 2 bullet points there, rooted in the reality of musical activity, and assessment is effective if it is genuinely musical and worthwhile. The storage of evidence may well be in the form of recordings, not things that are archived forever and never listened to or looked at again, but things that the children can access themselves and you can access with them so that they can learn from them, develop their work over time. So that's just a few comments. And the other comments later in this PowerPoint will be from that document. If planning is secure, if you know what you're teaching, then surely assessment is quite straightforward, because it'll be based on what you know you want the children to learn. So I think probably that slide there, for those of you that came to the previous network, what you've seen before, knowing what the small steps of progression are, designing the task to enable the next step or steps to take place, sharing the success criteria with the children, and then through observation and feedback, undertaking assessment activity to enable you then to provide either individual support or supporting the next activity for the whole class. So if you're planning for progression towards an end point, and that end point may contain a lot of component parts which have to come together, now thinking about perhaps creating a composition which involves understanding of notation, being able to record it accurately, being able to use perhaps melody and harmony effectively, and using textures and timbres and so on, using musical devices perhaps as well. And those small steps then need to be built into your planning as you move the children forward. So you have learning objectives. Perhaps you might say, well, everybody will this, most children will also that, and a few of them will progress further and do that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then assessment against those learning objectives and opportunity for children to achieve at different levels so that it's a positive experience for the children. And then after a course of time, you may be required to create some sort of summative assessment. And those departments I spoke to this week, who in my view were more successful, were telling me, yes, we do have data points, we do have to collect data, but we don't just put a task together in order to assess pupil. We take a holistic view of the pupil's work over a period of time and then we can decide on the summative assessment of them, rather than having an assessment activity at the end of a unit or at the end of a term. But we know our children, and we are recording what they're achieving as we go along, whether it's through a notebook or through a sheet in the back of the folder or whatever, and then we pull it all together from a range of work, and we can make a judgment on where they are and what they need to do next summatively. Now, the Daubney and Faultley document that I referred to just now has some examples of some assessment statements, and you'll probably recognise that these are very similar to the progress chart that we've produced for Key Stage 3 and circulated fairly widely. I was asked this week why it still says draft on it, and I suppose in a way we could take that draft off because it's been there for a long time, but actually to have a draft, nothing ever stays the same, and we might want to tweak it and amend it, and we don't want teachers to just take somebody else's statements, ours or the ones in this document, and use them if they don't fit. I mean, I would, if I was constructing some assessment statements for my department, I would be looking at a range of different people's assessment statements, the ones that the Music Hub has produced, the ones in the document, and devising my own around them, using these, if you like, as inspiration for the kind of things that we could be looking for in pupils' work and in their development. But I'll just show you that to say the document is worth looking at, and there are some useful pointers and signposts in it. I mentioned that a lot of us are probably using these sort of 3 levels of achievement: working towards, working at, or working beyond expectation. I actually don't agree with the document in the way it sets those 3 out. I would prefer it to be a kind of pyramid rather than a diamond, if you like. The diamond means working at is in the middle, most of us, a few are beyond and a few are below, whereas perhaps we should have an assessment structure which says, in this activity, we will all have achieved this. Most of us will also have achieved this, and a few will also have gone on further to achieve that. And then at least there's something positive that can be said. And I used to despair when I saw teachers who had done their kind of level statements put on walls of classrooms, and like level 1 was can't sing in tune. Well, that could be level -56 as far as we know. And it's not a very positive label to be put on a child, whereas the levels of attainment in music as they were cumulative, and they built on each other. They were saying at a simple level, this is what the child can do. At a slightly more advanced level, they will move on and be able to do this, and some will be able to move further. So I think that there's something to be thought about there. Okay, now this comes, and I haven't put the logo on this one because it's just simply a copy of what is written in the document that I'm talking about. That in a number of schools, this concept of the flight path to GCSE. Now, I know some of you may be using this and finding ways of using this effectively, but obviously their view, and you may or may not agree with it, is that it is a bit of a problem for music. Whilst, what about the 94% that don't go on to do GCSE, you might ask, and whether it's assumed that the GCSE assessment system will actually work backwards into Year 7. Assessment at Key Stage 3, the big message is it should be based on actual work done by pupils. And the use of GCSE grades to simply prove linear progression is, it says, of little help and often hinders effective musical learning and progression. That's their view. You may disagree, you may want to say so afterwards, but that's a point of view about that particular way of doing things. And again, I've already referred to my real experience this week of thinking about the idea of an assessment lesson at the end of a unit to provide data collection. It's important to note that assessment should be truly formative, and gathering of evidence on the hoof as the normal lesson progresses. may be preferable to saving it all up for the end. All the teacher then needs to do is to mark or note down when they notice something taking place. The idea of having a revision lesson and a final task lesson actually is taking precious lesson time, and you may want to ask yourself the question or challenge yourself, if you are doing assessment at end of units formally, whether in fact that is necessary, whether it's taking lesson time which could otherwise have been used. It may well be that you'll say to me, well, it's a motivation to get a piece of work finished, but maybe the going round the class listening to everybody in a lesson is a use of time. Okay, well, perhaps pupils are able to appraise each other's work, you might well say, and that also is a valuable activity if it doesn't spin on for too long and become rather monotonous. I don't know. It's something you might want to think about. But the suggestion in this document that I'm signposting to you is that it can hinder progress, and actually there may be an assessment criterion which is about having the confidence to perform in public, and that's a very valid musical skill, and it perhaps even contributes to personal confidence and cultural capital as to know how to perform and how to behave in performance. But in a large number of circumstances, it may well be that pupils don't perform at optimum level under pressure. So it might not provide the most useful formative data for teachers and pupils. Okay, so the questions that Ofsted inspectors may well ask you or be thinking about or to be discussing with you, because these comments are adapted from some guidance which inspectors have received, to ask whether the formative assessment is fit for purpose. Is it really a timely check that curriculum components have been remembered, rather than a summative test of composites? That's a completed task which involves a number of components operating together. Is it just a test of a composite which results in a grade or a number which doesn't actually break down the components that are required to be known and understood to contribute to that composite? So that's one of the questions that inspectors may well be thinking about when they talk to you about assessment. Is it disproportionate, inefficient or unsustainable for staff? I like the idea of a school that's got a central spreadsheet, but departments decide on their own timescales for adding to it. And don't all have to do it at a certain time. And then through the sort of quality assurance mechanisms, then discussions take place with departments at what's appropriate. And as you know, if you have music in the second half of the summer term on a Monday morning and Easter's late, or the first half of the summer term and Easter's late, you may only see them 3 times in that half term. If you have a lesson once a week, if you have a lesson once a fortnight, you might only see them once. So how can you produce half-termly data? And are pupils who fall behind identified whilst the learning is taking place, or are they only identified when you've done a summative assessment? Is it only clear that that pupil doesn't really understand what they're doing or hasn't developed the skill at the end of the process or the sequence of lessons, or are you identifying them on the way as you go along? And so there's just some things to think about in relation to feedback on learning and formative assessment. Yeah, I'm nearly finished. We did used to have these levels of attainment, those of us that can remember that. And I did think that those opening statements, that's actually levels 1 to 6, but I haven't numbered them deliberately because we don't have levels anymore. But I thought, nevertheless, there was some very, very broad progression within those statements. And when I was talking to primary teachers in the same session last week, we were being reminded that at the early stages of experience of music, the exploration stages is very important, that they can explore the resources and how sounds are made and find ways of changing sounds and then organizing them and then combining them together. So it might be, using the old-fashioned terminology, using a range of musical elements together and using them expressively. And for some children, the expressive bit might come earlier than the organising bit. It depends on their personal preferences. And then relationships between sounds and structures in music, and music representing different intentions. And then you move on to start to look at musical devices, scales, chords, sequences, ostinati, repetition, and all the musical devices that many of which cross cultures, don't they? How music reflects time and place. And then at a higher level, now how those devices combine together to create genuine, authentically sounding music in different genres and styles, and appreciating within a genre as you listen what the processes are that are going on to create that genre. And so that's a kind of progression that might be a very broad, overarching progression in a music curriculum for summative assessment. Now, in those levels that we used to have, there were then individual statements for performing, composing and listening. And I think if those individual statements were being written now, there'd be a little bit more emphasis on the academic aspects of music, on the theory, the notation, on the oral skills, than there were 10 years ago or so when these were current. But I just thought that might be a helpful starting point for thinking, and then hanging underneath it a range of statements then, which perhaps relating to different styles that children have learned and come into contact with, which might then be things that you will want to explore in terms of progression within those overarching statements. The idea that linear progression occurs in music is not one that is generally thought to be a very good idea. And in other subjects too, such as history, where you're exploring different historical contexts, people are saying, well, linear progression isn't really appropriate necessarily. So some people have developed assessment processes which go right away from the idea of numbers and levels and sub-levels and whatever. And this one, my last slide, is in the document. I'm not personally thinking I could find that easy to use. The idea was that in this unit, this child was very strong on their improvising, perhaps less strong on their playing. Unfortunately, what the recommendation is that you superimpose from one unit to another, or one assessment point to another, and then you can't see what's underneath. So it's just a logistical question I've got about this. But I do know, having travelled around one or two Staffordshire, Stoke and Telford schools, that there are some teachers who are finding that quite an interesting and useful way. And then you can actually say, this pupil is very strong on improvising, but not quite so strong on the technical aspects of musical performance, but they're quite good at creative in their approach to music. It might just be another way of looking at it. Well, have a look at the document, as I say, if you haven't already seen it, and give some consideration to different ways of recording assessments. In terms of having sets of statements set out for your learning activities, the idea of highlighting, perhaps in different highlighters, pens, or the children highlighting what they've achieved is one way of actually keeping tabs on it. And in our skills progression map, we have got a number of areas of musical learning, like performing, composing, oral awareness, reflecting and evaluating. And in different units or different sequences of lessons, there might be different things which they're going to achieve. You've set those out in advance, and then they can fill in or highlight when they've achieved those things. That's another way of looking at it. And the other approach, the notebook approach, you have a notebook for a class, and every child's got a page, and you just jot down things that you see happening, things a child has done well as you go. And then after a while, you look through your notebook and say, oh, well, those three children I've not even got anything about. So next lesson, I'll focus on those. Those different approaches, they've been around a while, I know, and people have tried them, tossed them around, and come to find them what they're most comfortable with. But I think the most important point is that assessment must be meaningful. It must identify very specifically what it is the children have achieved. It isn't just some random number which is either plucked out of the air or results from some kind of overall assessment. It needs to be useful to you as a teacher and useful and motivational for the children. Okay, well, I'll find a way of getting back to you now and turn off the I think I've stopped sharing, and we've got a lot more people here now than we had at the beginning, so nice to see you all, or to see your initials. I don't know who you all are, or I can guess some of you. So at this point, if you've got things you want to say, if you've got things you're grappling with in school that you're perhaps don't line up with what I've said, and might be able to get some ideas from each other and share. If you don't have anything to say, if nobody has anything to say, well, we'll call the meeting closed and finish. But if I can just open it up now, I can see the screen and I can see the chat, which mainly seems to be telling me that people have either joined or left, mainly joined. So do please either put your hand up or just simply unmute and chip in. No chips yet. Thinking time.
No, it doesn't look like anyone's going to pop in, does it, Graham?
Well, I just wonder if anybody is finding they're required to produce data in a way that isn't helpful in music. That's often the situation I come across when I go into schools. Or whether, in fact, the data collection aspect has become a little bit less of a focus in schools due to the change in the Ofsted framework. Just out of interest, has anybody had an Ofsted inspection this half term? Good. The answer to that obviously is no. They are going on. Thank you, Anne-Met. You do not have to change to numbers. No, don't. If you're happily doing something which is informing you, yeah, because I've seen people who are just. I mean, this poor student that I had, he was having to somehow relate every activity to the levels, and the levels were never intended to be like that. They were intended to be at the end of the key stage. This is a level 4B, and we're all going to do 4B. And if the department hasn't moved everybody through one sub level in the term, then they would be considered to be failing. And this is just it's gone mad. It had gone mad. Hopefully, it will become less of an issue as the message gets through to schools. And I'd say the principles that I've mentioned have been around for 30 years and more. Obviously, they weren't around when I was at school, as you realise. But they are the same principles, but it's been blown around and tossed around in different ways. Here's somebody, Vicky in Telford, who's finding steps not helpful and completely overhauling your assessment policy. Yeah. I shouldn't talk about where I've been this week. You don't know where I've been this week anyway, but it was very helpful to actually talk to heads of department who have been told that they didn't have to record their assessment in any particular format. If it was just a comment, words, if it was a number, it had to be useful to the department. And departments were able to decide how often they did that, and that was obviously overseen, and there were discussions with senior leaders with the department. But there is plenty of material out there, and I'm sure the research report in music, when it comes out, will reinforce the same message. Well, it better do anyway. Reinforce the same message that progress in music isn't just linear. There are lots of strands to musical progress, some of which go faster than others. Well, a couple of comments there in the chat. Thank you for those, Annette and Vicky. Anybody else want to add anything? I'm happy to think that if you don't want to talk, then we won't pursue it any longer. Rachel, did you want to add anything? Oh, she's probably transferring from car to home.
I am at home, yeah. I've not long got home. I'm waiting for someone to knock on the door because I've blocked them in. Next door having some drinking.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter. I just wonder whether you, you, as a consultant and as a practicing music leader in a school, I can talk, but you've actually got obviously the on the ground experience of doing it. Yeah, anything you wanted to say?
We've just had a new assessment policy, and I sat in a meeting just saying this doesn't work for us. It just doesn't work. So we're just going to have to fit hours around it, really. It's changed to people wanting, so we have assessment, it's 2 assessments, which is good. But they want it to be like a formal exam type thing. And it's just like that doesn't work for music.
I'm getting the comments now about the Fisher Family Trust and whatever. It's not helpful. I mean, we did raise this with Ofqual at a conference years ago, and the chap then said, "Oh, well, it's the most reliable way available. There's nothing more reliable available." Well, it doesn't mean to say it is reliable if there's nothing better available. It means that nothing is reliable. This idea that if they're going to get certain grades in English and maths and they'll do the same in music, it doesn't work like that. I was awful at art at school, and I was good at music, so it's just nonsense, I would say. But you don't say it quite like that to your senior leaders. But I mean, obviously the sort of baseline assessment idea is you do units which will give you opportunity to find out what children can do, and that may involve their social skills and being able to work in groups and all that sort of stuff as well. And you can start from there, perhaps. But there we are. Not really relevant, Vicky says, and Simon is saying something very similar. Andrew is asking marking stickers. Like to introduce them, but it doesn't work. Unhelpful method of feedback. So do you want to unmute, Andrew, and just explain what you mean by marking stickers?
Yeah, that's fine, Graham. So the learning objectives become targets on progress stickers. And then there's an expectation under our whole school policy, which I have adapted for music and performing arts, that every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks in our case, we stick, or the children stick, this feedback sticker or this marking sticker into their books. And as teachers, or they can do it as pupils if it's a self-assessment, will then tick either WWW for what went well or EBI against the targets that have been generated from the learning objectives. And I just find that whole process quite pointless, if I'm honest, when a comment is far more effective, a personalised comment, rather than going through that whole process. It seems to me that the sort of, like what you were saying earlier on about the system coming before what is actually helpful, but sort of taking your, I suppose, whole school view as an Ofsted inspector rather than just specific to music. Is that something which you've seen working in schools that you have inspected and which can work? And am I being too critical of that system, and do I just need to find a way to adapt it and make it work, I suppose?
We see all sorts of systems, and Ofsted doesn't have a view on whether one system is better than another. I think it's whether we feel it is helping children to progress. And of course, a lot of it is about talking to children, taking groups of children and saying, okay, show me your work. What does this mean? How helpful is this to you? And getting some sort of response from them. And maybe that might be a way for yourself to investigate how useful it is to the children. Books, what books? In music, I know that there have been comments about whether, in fact, on a work scrutiny and Ofsted inspection, one would expect to see a lot of written work in music. HMI said to me once that he much preferred to be looking at recordings on a computer screen than actually seeing lots of written work. Although I think the curriculum has moved a little bit more towards the academic side. If it's taking time, which is taking away from musical activity, I see quite a lot of things whereby the teacher makes an assessment and then there's purple pen time or something in a lesson. This is in all subjects where the child then has to write their comment on the teacher's comment. And we see all sorts of comments that the children write, and usually the quality of the comment tells us something about the quality of their learning. This is a load of rubbish or something someone writes. But yeah, Vicky is saying that she's tried it at the previous school and it did take a lot of time and had little impact. I think that's the thing, isn't it? If it is helping the children to learn, if it isn't, then you need to sort of try and gather some evidence from the children to say that it isn't and there's a better way. Anybody else got any views on that? Not at the moment. It's often that you get an external consultant coming into a school that speaks passionately about a particular way of doing things, and everybody jumps to it. It's like going on a Kadai course, and you think, oh, how wonderful. And you get back to the classroom and you try and do it, and you haven't got enough understanding of it to actually really make it work. I'm not saying you don't understand it, but I'm just thinking that it can spin off something that may actually not be totally embedded. Do see quite a lot now of the teacher looking at the work. I'm thinking more in terms of written work, not actually marking it, but then picking up generic points that all the class needs to go over more, rather than individual comments. But that's, again, it's just using assessment, isn't it? Using your assessment of the children to plan the next steps. If it helps you to plan the next steps, if it helps the children to move forward, if it isn't helping them to do so, then it is a waste of time. Anybody else want to make any other comments? As I say, if you are up against difficult situations in your school with senior leaders asking you to do things which you think are unhelpful to the subject, then there is material out there. There are documents. That particular one I've shared with you bits of is very helpful in that respect. And again, I'm sure the Ofsted reports on the research in music will be saying the similar sorts of things. Robin Hamilton, who used to be the Ofsted lead for music, said when levels were abandoned, he said, please don't invent another set of numbers to replace the set of numbers we've just stopped using. So that's what we want to avoid. Okay, I think that probably is 20 past, unless there's anybody else that is anxious to speak. Tracy, are you in charge, Tracy?
Well, I'm in charge. Well, apparently, I wouldn't know. Apparently,
but to go to the governor's meeting.
Yes, he has. So thank you very much, Graham. It's been very informative. We'll stay around if anybody doesn't want to put anything in the chat and wants a quick chat afterwards. Me, Graham, Rachel and Jenny will be here. So by all means, stay on the call. If not, thank you very much for attending this evening. I understand that you're all really busy and probably looking forward to the end of term. Contact your local music service if you're not sure of anything. We'll do our best to help you in whatever way we can. But thank you for attending tonight.
Thank you.